Brooke, thank you. It's a distinct pleasure to be back in front of this audience, and we're fortunate to have that Public Policy Foundation, and I want to say to the members of the Texas legislature that are here, I didn't get where I got by myself. It was a great team that I had the privilege to work with, and thank you for being. Sometimes you're a little hard to get to move along in my direction, or me to move in your direction, because it truly is a partnership. And so thank you to each of you. I want to spend some time with you today talking about the most pressing issue, I think, for our people, for people like you and for people like me. People who share our values, who from all across this country, all across this state, and I'm not talking about the election, although I do have some opinions about that. Kellyanne, I'm glad to be here with you today and to hear your observations about that election. But that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. It's about something that is affecting this election, though, and it will affect much more than this election if we don't do something about it. When Ronald Reagan left office in 1989, America knew, matter of fact, the entire world knew, the value of individual liberty and limited government. Whether you lived in East Berlin, Germany, or you lived in East Bernard, Texas, whether you were a multi-generational Texan or whether you were a new immigrant from Vietnam, you knew that conservative principles would make your life better and those of the people around you. But think about this. Most Americans in their 20s today weren't even alive when Ronald Reagan was president. The reason that we've had the political year that we've had is because fewer Americans remember how well liberty can serve them and their families. As everyone here at ALEC knows, the conservative movement is thriving in dozens of states, including my beloved Texas. But at the national level, the level of the Electoral College, we're losing. Now, we can blame it on bad politicians all we want. We can blame it on the media, who's always stacking the deck against us. But here's the truth. And it's one that we in this room must confront. Winners don't make excuses. We have not done enough to show people who don't share our views why they should come over to our side. We conservatives are really good at talking to each other about what's wrong. We're really good at preaching to the converted. But we're not so good at reaching out to those who disagree and winning them over. During my 14 years as governor of Texas, we did a lot of good things. You've heard some of them here spoken about today. We passed historic tax relief. I was proud to sign a balanced budget for each of those 14 years, Steve. The economic growth that followed helped every Texan, rich or poor. Texas companies created almost 1/3 of all the jobs during that entire period of time. Texas became the #1 exporting state in the nation and still is there. Texas high school graduation rate went from 27th in the nation in 2003 to second highest in the country in 2013. Our most, Kellyanne, it's like what you were talking about that Governor Pence did here. Our most recent African American graduates live in the state that has the highest graduation rate for African Americans in America, 13 points higher than the national average. And that matters. It matters a lot, and it matters because those kids that graduate from high school, they'll make 50% more in their lifetimes than those who don't graduate. So you see, the record's really clear. Our policies have made life better for all Texans, those at the top and those down at the bottom. So why is it? Why is it that our movement continues to do so poorly with minorities? In the 2014 governor election in Texas, my friend Greg Abbott, he crushed Wendy Davis. I mean, crushed her. But Wendy Davis won 93% of the African American vote. Now again, we can blame the left, we can blame political correctness, we can blame those who, gin up resentment out there, who find grievance at every turn. I have an alternative explanation. But first, I want to share with you a story of something that happened 102 months ago at a courthouse in McLennan County, Texas. On May the 15th of 1916, there was this mentally disabled 17-year-old boy named Jesse Washington. And he was convicted of raping and murdering the wife of his employer. He pled guilty, and he was sentenced to death. But Jesse Washington did not die an ordinary death because he was black. After that death sentence was issued, Jesse was dragged out of the McLennan County Courthouse and into a crowd of hundreds. And thanks to the advent of a new technology called the telephone, the word spread pretty quickly as to what was about to happen, and soon there were 15,000 people watching Jesse Washington be tortured, mutilated, tied over the branch of a tree. Somebody lit a fire underneath him and raised him up into the air. He tried to climb up tried to climb up that chain to avoid that fire. Somebody started cutting his fingers off so that he couldn't keep climbing. One man castrated him. Another one used a pole to push him back over the fire. A prominent local photographer took pictures of Jesse's charred remains and he sold them as souvenirs on postcards. Now, we made a lot of progress since 1916. A half a century ago, Republicans and Democrats came together to finally enshrine into law the principle that all of us, regardless of our race, our color, our national origin, are created equal. When it comes to race, America is a better and more tolerant and more welcoming place than it's ever been before. We are the country of Hispanic CEOs, of Asian billionaires, a black president. And that's why this story that I'm fixing to share with you about Erica Jean Dockery is so troubling. Erica was a single mom of 3, and she worked 2 jobs to support her children. During the day, she was a home health aide, and at night she was working making sandwiches at Subway. In April of 2003, she was hauled before a grand jury because her boyfriend, Alfred Dwayne Brown, he had been suspected of murdering a police officer during a burglary. Now, Erica told the grand jury that Alfred couldn't have committed this murder because he was asleep on her couch on the morning of the murder. And he'd even called her on her landline phone at that time. And she said if he did it, then he deserves whatever's coming to him, truly. But neither the prosecutor nor the grand jury would accept her explanation They threatened to separate her from her children if she didn't turn her boyfriend in. You know, said the grand jury foreman, the kids, your kids, are going to be taken by Child Protective Services, and you're going to go to the penitentiary, and you won't see your children for a long, long time. Now, eventually, Erica told a different story, that she had left her house earlier that night and that she wasn't sure if Alfred had been on her couch at the time of the murder or not. The Harris County prosecutor judge, this is a man by the name of Dan Rizzo, he decided to charge Erica with perjury. Lock her up for 4 months in the county jail, away from her young children. Rizzo told her that they would only release her from jail if she said definitively that her boyfriend hadn't been in her home. And this mother, distraught over being away from her kids, said that Alfred had admitted to her that he had murdered the police officer. In exchange for this testimony, prosecutors released Erica from jail on the condition that she wear an ankle monitor and call a homicide detective once a week. At Alfred's trial in 2005, she testified that Alfred had told her that he was there when that police officer was murdered. Alfred Dwayne Brown was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. 7 years later, 7 years after Alfred's conviction, a reporter for the Houston Chronicle reported that Erica's phone records were found in the garage of a homicide detective, indicating that Alfred had indeed called Erica from her apartment phone at the time of her murder, confirming her initial story. For reasons unknown, the prosecution never made those records available during Alfred's trial. After a delay of more than a year, the judge in the case agreed to a new trial, and in 2015, Alfred was released from death row. You know, there may be some that would say, well, that story had a happy ending because Alfred was released. But his life was almost destroyed because of an overzealous prosecutor who concealed exonerating evidence, and Erica's children were put in harm's way because a grand jury that acted as the arm of the prosecution rather than an independent check on government power. Sometimes we forget that the IRS isn't the only government agency capable of abusing its authority. Anyone wielding the power of the state faces the temptation to abuse it. And when it comes to prosecutors, there are clearly bad apples in the system who care more about indicting anyone, than they care about convicting the right person. You may know that I was indicted in 2014 on 2 frivolous felony charges. Eventually, those charges were dismissed because I was lucky enough to have some pretty high-powered, high-paid lawyers working for me. Erica Jean Dockery had no such luxury. When ambitious prosecutors go overboard, the true victims aren't people like you and me. They're people like Erica and Alfred, who don't have the means to fight back. I hope these stories have helped explain why even today African Americans lack confidence in the fairness of our justice system. And by the way, African Americans don't just struggle in our courts. After 2 decades of declining violent crimes in our cities, we're losing ground. According to a study by the Washington Post, homicides in our 50 largest cities are up 17% in the last year. That is the largest increase in the last quarter of a century. A quarter of all African Americans live below the poverty line. Even after the impact of federal programs like food stamps and housing subsidies, the supplemental poverty rate for African Americans is nearly double the rate for other Americans. Democrats have long had the opportunity to govern in African American communities. It is time to help black families hold them accountable for their results. And I'm here to tell you that it's Republicans, not Democrats, who are truly offering black Americans the hope of a better life for themselves and their children. I'm here to tell you, and I'm proud to live in a country with an African American president. But President Obama cannot be proud of his record of improving black lives. Earlier this month, the president spoke at a memorial service for 5 police officers gunned down in Dallas, Texas. His families and friends mourned. The president said that we shouldn't be surprised that, quote, tensions boil over, because we don't spend enough on government programs. The president blamed you and all other Americans for allowing poverty to fester in our urban communities. The president couldn't resist injecting a political lecture into a moment that should have been apart from politics. But that day in Dallas, the president showed us something else, something worse. That he and Hillary Clinton, if they get their way, African Americans will be worse off than they are today. Overwhelmingly, the cities where the left-wing solutions have been tried over and over again, places like Detroit and Chicago and Baltimore, African Americans are falling further behind. In 2010, President Obama enacted the largest expansion of the welfare state in 50 years. And yet, the prevalence of black poverty has actually increased under his leadership. We cannot dismiss the historical legacy of slavery, nor its role in causing the problem of black poverty. And because slavery and segregation were sanctioned by government, there is a role for government policy in addressing their lasting effects. But the specific policies enacted by President Obama and advanced by Hillary Clinton amount to little more than throwing money at the problem and then walking away. We spend $450 billion a year on Medicaid, and yet health outcomes for those on Medicaid are no better than for those with no insurance at all. Instead of reforming Medicaid, the president expanded it under Obamacare. Mr. President, I say with the greatest respect, it is you who has allowed poverty to fester in African American community. It is you who has trapped black children in failing schools, and it is you who has made African Americans less safe. The president and the Black Lives Matter movement he supports never acknowledge the incredible gains achieved by the police on behalf of African Americans. Thanks to leaders like Rudy Giuliani and Ray Kelly in New York, thousands of blacks are not killed by criminals each year. Those Black Lives matter too. But we cannot dismiss the experience of men like my good friend Senator Tim Scott, who said the other day that he didn't know many African American men who do not have a story to tell, no matter the profession, no matter their income, no matter their disposition in life, of being stopped by a police officer while doing nothing. Those of us who aren't black are sometimes too quick to dismiss those complaints. And given America's dark history of inequality before the law, it is understandable that African Americans care passionately about having confidence in our system of laws and the fairness by which they're enforced. Shedrick Willis was a slave before the Civil War, and he was literally bought and sold on the steps of the McLennan County Courthouse, the very place where 100 years ago that 17-year-old Jesse Washington was dragged to his death. When I was governor of Texas, I had the honor of appointing Shedrick Willis's great-great-great-grandson, Wallace Jefferson, to be the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court of Texas. And in 2004, I appointed Wallace to be the Supreme Court's first black Chief Justice. In Texas, we've made a difference. We've made a real difference in the lives of African American families. We haven't eliminated black poverty in Texas, but neither have we allowed it to fester. In New York, the supplemental poverty rate is 26%. In California, it is 30%. In Washington, D.C., it is 33%. In Texas, it's just 20%. In 2014, Texas had the lowest crime rate since 1968, and the improvements keep coming. Last year, while crime rates, they rose in other states, we saw them decrease by 5% in Houston, 5% in San Antonio, 5% in Dallas, 8% in Fort Worth, and 10% in Austin. The record is clear. So why is it? Why is it that our movement fails to gain black support? As I said earlier, we can blame the political correctness movement out there. We can blame those who gin up resentment, people who find a grievance at every turn. But Republicans have much to do to earn the trust of African Americans. You see, blacks remember that Barry Goldwater in 1964 ran against Lyndon Johnson, who was the champion of civil rights. They know that Barry Goldwater opposed that Civil Rights Act in 1964 because he felt that parts of it were unconstitutional. States supporting segregation in the South, they cited states' rights as a justification for keeping blacks from the voting booth or from the lunch counter. And as you know, I am an ardent believer and a proponent of the 10th Amendment, which was ratified in 1791 as part of our Bill of Rights. And the 10th Amendment says that the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, or reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. I know that state governments are more accountable to you than the federal government is. But I'm also an ardent believer in the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall deny to any jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. There has been and will continue to be an important and legitimate role for the federal government in enforcing civil rights. Too often, we Republicans, myself included, have emphasized our message on the 10th Amendment, but not our message on the 14th. An amendment it bears reminding that was one of the first great contributions of the Republican Party to American life, second only to the abolition of slavery. For too long, we Republicans have been content to lose the black vote because we found that we didn't need them to win elections. But when we gave up on trying to win the support of African Americans, we lost our moral legitimacy as the party of Lincoln, as the party of equal opportunity for all. It is time for us. It is time for us to once again reclaim our heritage as the only party in our country founded on the principle of freedom for African Americans. You know, one of the most important things that we did in Texas while I was governor was reform our sentencing laws so that nonviolent offenders could stay out of prison. And we can do more. And we can do it while keeping our low-income communities safe from crime. Last year, we abolished the pick-a-pal system, which effectively allowed prosecutors to put their friends and neighbors on the grand juries for the purpose of predetermining their outcome. They passed and I signed into law the Michael Morton Act, which allowed the defense to review prosecution's evidence before trial. New York and Colorado recently enacted laws that allow defense attorneys some access to the grand jury room, the production of witness transcripts, and advance notice for witnesses, Phil, so that they can have time to retain counsel. We should strengthen the capacity of bar associations to discipline prosecutors who intentionally mislead grand juries and hide exculpatory evidence. And victims of prosecutorial abuse should be able to receive compensation for their suffering. As Texans got smarter about policing, about crime prevention, we came to appreciate the importance of keeping promising young people out of jail. We're working to stop that intergenerational cycle of incarceration where a grandchild meets their grandparents behind prison bars. In 2006, there were around 5,000 Texas kids that were locked up. Today, because of the work that these members of the legislature did, it's closer to 1,000. In 1990, there was a teenager named Tyrone Brown. He failed a marijuana test. He made a mistake. He was on probation, and for that single violation, he was sentenced to life in prison. In 2007, I granted Tyrone a conditional pardon. But half of all the prison admissions come from people whose parole are provoked. So we shifted money away from building more prisons towards specialized drug courts and programs that would help those in prison succeed on parole. President Obama and Secretary Clinton, they say that the best way to reduce crime is through more welfare. But here's what I say, and here's what I've seen in my time in public service. The best welfare program in America is a job. But it's hard to get a job if you got a criminal conviction on your record, and that's why criminal justice reform is so important. But there's even a bigger reason why Democrat policies have failed to cure poverty, and it's because the only true cure for poverty is a job, and these Democrat policies have made it too hard for the poor to find work. You know, there are many poor Americans who want to leave welfare and regain the dignity of having that job in the workforce, but because of taxes, Steve, and the regulations, and it often makes more economic sense to stay on welfare than get a full-time job. Furthermore, you got these federal programs that they impose this one-size-fits-all approach to fighting poverty. And the fact is, in California, somebody might need more money to deal with the cost of housing. And over on the other coast in Massachusetts, it might be the cost of vocational schools. But instead, we force the poor to enroll in these separate programs for housing assistance or Pell Grants. Congress should pass a welfare reform bill that will take the money that we already spend on non-healthcare related anti-poverty programs and split it into two parts. The first part should be an expanded and reformed version of the Earned Income Tax Credit so that anyone with a job can live above the poverty level. And the second part should consist of a block grant that goes back to you and the states to care for their safety nets of your populations in a manner that you best know how to deal with. And we all know we've got to improve our schools. This is an area where President Obama, he had extraordinary potential, but he caved into the demands of the labor unions. It is a fallacy to assume that the vastly different student populations across the country can be adequately educated with one-size-fits-all policies. We need to empower you legislators, you school boards, you parents, to implement policies that address your students, your children, and keep schools accountable and efficient. Enterprising charter school teachers like Eva Moskowitz in New York, she ought to be able to replicate the astounding success that she's had all over the country without the interference of federal government. And we've got to tackle this exorbitant cost of a college education. One of the biggest barriers that we have in this country today, a barrier for you getting into the middle class, black or otherwise, is this high cost of a college degree. A 4-year degree at the typical private college costs $170,000. What in the hell are they teaching them that costs that much money? Compare that to the medium home price in this country is $205,000. We are literally asking these students to mortgage their future in order to gain a college degree. And it's got to end. In Texas, I challenged our universities to come up with a 4-year college degree for less than $10,000. Now, there were a lot of people who said it can't be done. It's impossible. You cannot drive tuition and fees that low. But today, there are 13 Texas universities that have reached that target. We are on the cusp of an online revolution in higher education, but only if the federal government rolls back the rules that make it almost impossible to gain accredited bachelor's degrees achieved with online instruction. Furthermore, just as with college tuition, we have to reduce the cost of living for those who need every dollar to be stretched as far as it can go. Regulations like the minimum wage hikes and Obama's employer mandates, they drive up the cost of hiring new workers. That means that companies hire fewer people, but it also means that the price of basic consumer goods go up. Earlier this year, the Competitive Enterprise Institute estimated that federal regulations cost American businesses $1.9 trillion a year. That's nearly $15,000 for every household in America. And then you add state regulations on top of that, and the problem gets even worse. If we, as state and local lawmakers, do these 5 things: keep nonviolent offenders out of prison, lift barriers to urban jobs, incentivize work, reform our schools, and reduce the cost of living, we will have done more for African Americans than the last 3 Democrat administrations combined. At the American Cemetery in Normandy, there are 9,387 American soldiers that are buried in orderly row after orderly row. A general once said, if there was ever proof needed that we fought for a cause and not for conquest, it could be found in these cemeteries. Here was our only request, all we ask: enough soil in which to bury our gallant dead. Some of our gallant dead were sons of presidents, like Theodore Roosevelt. Most were just ordinary Americans, simply doing what their country asked of them. Some of the graves don't even have names. They're simply marked, "Here rests in honor glory a comrade in arms, known but to God." Some of the most compelling graves at Normandy are for African Americans who served in segregated regiments, like Willie Collins. He was with the 490th Port Battalion. Willie Collins made the ultimate sacrifice for America, despite the fact that America didn't always treat him in the way he deserved. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and Sergeant Willie Collins grew up in very different circumstances. Ted's ancestors had a coat of arms. Willie's ancestors were brought here in chains. But Ted and Willie joined themselves. They joined themselves together with a commitment that every generation of American has embraced. The promise of leaving America and the world a better place than they found it, of ensuring a better future for the children and the grandchildren of those to come. I will tell you, I'm a beneficiary of the sacrifices that Sergeant Collins and General Roosevelt made, and so many others, known but to God. I grew up in this little place that Brooke shared with you called Paint Creek. When I was young, we had an outhouse and we had a number 2 wash tub on the back porch that my mom bathed us in. We attended Paint Creek Rural School. For some of the teachers, literally lived on campus. That profession of teaching was literally their lives, and they inspired me. And I can assure you, none of those teachers had a clue that they were instructing a former Air Force pilot and, God forbid, a governor of Texas. But they also have a motto at that little school that summarizes the endless possibilities, if you will, for the students. It says, "No dream too tall for a school so small." I had 13 in my graduating class. Many people don't feel that their lives today are filled with endless possibilities anymore. Americans are entering adulthood today, and they got good reason to fear that it's going to be harder for them to earn a living, to buy a home, pay off their debts, than it was for their parents. But if there's one thing that we can learn from Willie Collins and the millions just like him, from the tragedy of Jesse Washington to the triumph of Wallace Jefferson, it's that America has overcome far greater obstacles than the ones that we face today. Willie Collins died in the belief that America could become a better country than the one he left home to serve. And he was right. It's up to us to be worthy of the country that Willie Collins' generation gave us. It's up to us to leave our country better off than we found it. America's never been perfect. No country composed of imperfect beings ever could be. But there is no country that has achieved more than the United States of America. And with new leadership and durable reforms, America can be freer and stronger than it has ever been. America can be that exceptional place where nothing in life is guaranteed, but where we can restore the faith of all Americans of all colors and creeds in the power of liberty and in equality of justice, where we all have the opportunity to build a better lives for ourselves and our children. God bless you, and thank you all for what you do.